to have Ditte Juul Jørgensen here, the Director General of Energy for Europe, which, given everything that's going on in the world right now, is it's an incredible privilege for Oxford to have you speaking to us here about everything that's happening and about the bigger picture, the longer-term picture, about the European Commission's plans for energy going forward. And just a few words about Ditte Juul Jørgensen. Did her degree in law, so bear that in mind, the students here. But then went on into working in law with the European Court of Justice and the European Commission's Director General for Competition. Before joining head of economic section of the EU in the EU delegation to the United Nations in New York, before coming back to Brussels as head of the unit for trade and sustainable development, and then moving up through to director, head of unit, and finally Director General for Energy in the European Commission. Ditte Juul Jørgensen, actually, we're also privileged here because this may be your last talk as DG ENER, actually, because Ditte Juul Jørgensen is moving to the much easier job of DG Trade and Security for the European Commission. So we respect your resilience and your willingness to take on tough roles. We're particularly grateful to have you here because, well, obviously with everything that's going on in the world, as many of you will know, we had previously scheduled this talk and then something happened in the Middle East just before it took off, and for entirely understandable reasons, Ditte Juul Jørgensen had to stick to the day job of keeping the lights on in Europe. We're incredibly grateful you're here. I was worried when I noticed you checking your phone just now. I said, oh no, something happened. But anyway, hopefully we'll have you for the next hour or so. And Ms. Juul Jørgensen has said she's happy to take, obviously we've got time allocated for questions at the end. If there's something you really, it's okay, so we were talking about this, if there's something you really don't understand about what she's saying or some point of fact, and it's a very short question, and I emphasize question, that's something which has a question mark at the end of it, then you can put your hand up during the talk just for clarification. But obviously keep your substantive questions to the end, and I'll be chairing those and so on. But anyway, thank you very much for joining us. It's an honor to have you here, and over to you to talk about the powering the future in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Miles. Thank you very much, Miles, for the kind introduction, but also for the invitation for me to join you here. As you said, I was supposed to be here in early March, which happened to be just then a few days after the current crisis in the Middle East and the Strait of Hormuz started. And I'd hoped I could still make it here, but the situation became fairly dramatic in global energy markets, energy security, very, very quickly. And so there was work to do in Brussels. But I'm really glad to have this opportunity and to have it, as you said, before I leave my current role as Director General for Energy. I will be doing trade and economic security, also very, very interesting. And a lot of energy in that, a lot of climate in that, a lot of hopefully lessons learned also on crisis management that I can bring to that new role. So I look forward to that, but I'm really grateful to have this opportunity today to meet all of you. So what I thought I would do is I will give you just a very, very brief kind of EU in the world, just in case you don't know anything at all about the EU, then that will give you just a few nuggets of information that maybe will help underpin the rest. I will then talk about the main strategic objectives of European energy policy, and then I will get into some of the crises that we see, some of the challenges we see in terms of resilience, security of supply, and security more broadly, and how we have handled those and what is ahead. So if I start with a bit of the European Union, we are a global power, but a different global power, because we are a cooperation, as you know, of 27 member states, more than 450 million Europeans. We represent a fairly limited part of the global population, a much higher share of GDP, and we of course have the advantages of being several countries working together, different history, different geography, different circumstances, different times of joining the European Union, and we have the challenges that come with that. And I mention that because when you talk about energy policy or energy circumstances and you talk about a European average of anything, I want you to bear in mind that a European average hides quite a different reality, whether it's energy mix or whether it's GDP or circumstances. European average is always interesting to look at, but it's actually more interesting when you go into the 27 and you see what does it mean to be a small landlocked country compared to a country close to the North Sea or a country that has many hours of sun for solar or whatever the differences are. But a significant global player, even more when it comes to trade, where you can see we actually have a higher share in trade than our population would justify. We are, for many countries across the world, we are the single largest trading partner, the largest partner for investment, or the largest service exchange partner. So a very, very significant role in global economics, of course, for historic reasons as well, and a role that we use very actively to enter into either strategic partnerships or trade agreements or trade and investment, clean trade and investment partnerships with countries across the world. But a significant presence and partner in global trade, obviously for the United Kingdom as well, both because of the geographic proximity, but also because until not so long ago, we were 28 European Union member states and the United Kingdom was one. We now have a close geographic proximity stays. We also have a close trade and investment relationship despite that change. So that is the shortest version of the European Union. There's a lot more I could say, but if I start on that, you will not be able to stop me. So we'll move on to the next, but of course in the questions, if you want to hear more about the EU, glad to tell you more about that as well. Now, looking at energy policy specifically, and I should say energy policy is the field that I lead policy making on as part of the administration, the European Commission. I do not lead, for example, on climate. I have an excellent colleague who does climate. We obviously work super closely together because our different policy instruments have to speak with each other and be complementary. I also don't do transport policy. Somebody else does that. But again, there's a very strong energy component of that. So my field is energy policy, specifically both the European energy market and energy policy and regulation, but also the international aspects of energy policy. Now, you don't have to know these treaty articles, but I do quite like them. I must say I'm a lawyer, as Miles said, so I will be very, very brief and not be too nerdy legal. The energy article in our treaty, the treaty for the European Union, is a treaty on the functioning of the European Union, to be precise, has an article 194 that establishes the energy policy. That's kind of the constitution. What is the European part of energy policy? Just what's interesting to know is it came fairly late. So in the original treaties, energy policy was not covered. As you can see, it has some fairly clear objectives, including environment and with environment, climate, the internal market, solidarity, security, so no big surprises there. What you don't see on the screen is that this is paragraph 1. There's a paragraph 2, which doesn't say the opposite, but it does indicate a bit of a tension between what do we do together in Europe and what do national governments decide. So the paragraph 2, not visible on screen, essentially says, okay, that's fine, we've got a common policy, but national governments decide on their own energy mix. And so that is what we are working on, and those are some of the limits of what we do together. We still work very closely together, including on the European energy mix, but there is that balance between European and national. The other article is just for you to know that when there is a crisis, when there is an emergency, we can be very, very swift. And I will speak a bit more about that afterwards. But one of the ways in which we act more swiftly is to make use of this emergency legal base where we can adopt temporary legislation, temporary regulation, only with Council. And here Council
is the body where the 27 governments meet. I will say more about that later, but it is important to know the normal legislation in normal times, if you will, is what we call ordinary legislative procedure, and that requires both Council, so the 27 member states, and the European Parliament to agree. They are the two chambers or the two legislative bodies of the European Union. Our energy policy rests essentially on three strategic objectives. They are reflected in the treaty, but they've also become the underpinning of our energy policy, of the direction of our energy policy. And this will not be a surprise to any of you, I'm sure. They are essentially what is often referred to as the energy trilemma. I must say I don't much like the notion of a trilemma because it does seem to suggest that there is a tension and you have to choose between one and the other. I think the reality is rather that it is that it shows that these three objectives give you a hint about the complexity of the transition, that it is a movement, that there is a change. All change is difficult. A fundamental transition is even more difficult. It takes time. So it is not that there is a conflict or a tension between these three objectives. It is rather that you constantly, every day in policy, every day in investments, every day in action, have to try to find out at this point in time, in the current geopolitical circumstances, in the current climate circumstances, in the current economic circumstances, how do you best always manage the three and balance the three so that your action, our regulation, our policy making, our initiatives, our cooperation, that they all help us make that push towards achieving these three strategic objectives. So they're not opposites, it's not difficult to meet the three, but it is complex because a transition is complex. So I will say a bit more about that, but feel free to ask about it because I know the trilemma is a much liked term. I'm not quite sure I agree that it is a trilemma. It is just that transitions are difficult, and we are going from one system that has been built over decades or more than decades into a different system, and we have to manage that and do it smartly to do it in the most efficient way, lower the costs, and do it as fast as possible, but again, making sure that we're both secure and sustainable and competitive. So where are we right now, and what has happened? What's the pace of development? What's the pace of change? And here you will see the full European energy mix about 10 years ago, and then just a few years ago. Unfortunately, that's the 2024 is the latest data we have. You will see that changes continue more or less in the direction you can see here. But essentially, the single biggest change has been the significant growth in renewables, while coal has decreased quite significantly. That's the very big shift over those 10 years. And that is, of course, a result of a lot of policy framing, policy measures. We've got the emissions trading scheme. That's climate policy, is not with me, but it is a very important driver of change, an important driver of energy policy. The price attached to CO2, which means that coal as an energy source is much less attractive than it would have been otherwise, and the same with other fossils. But you will also see, despite the investments, despite the policy, despite all the things that we have been doing, fossil is actually still a very significant part of our energy system. And we'll come back to that later, but it is still 2/3 of our total energy mix that is fossil. And that also means, while we are working to reduce that and working towards the phasing out of fossil fuels, it is important to know that it will take several decades. It is simply a very significant part. You don't just remove 2/3 of your energy mix. And so we're going to need fossil, oil and gas in the coming decades in reduced amounts compared to now, but it will take time to get rid of it. And there are questions of how to manage the carbon in those decades. This is electricity mix only. And that is quite a nice, it's a positive story, because if you look at the various sectors of the European economy and how have they developed over the last decade, you can see that the electricity, the power generation, is the one that has been decarbonizing the fastest, the most efficiently, and very, very big, in big part, thanks, of course, to renewable energy. It's been a combination of lower costs solar, photovoltaic. It's been a combination of significant investments in wind and European wind manufacturing and European leadership in wind, both onshore and offshore. And then, of course, hydro and geothermal, the green fuels, the clean fuels, so different things. But it really is primarily renewables that has helped drive that change. When we look at the crisis, you will see the numbers, because if you look at what has happened since Russia invaded Ukraine and we had the 2022 energy crisis, there's been quite a significant acceleration, of course supported by policy measures, simplification and faster permitting. So I'll come to that, but I do want to give you this. The downside of this is a very nice positive story. The downside of that is that electricity is less than a quarter of our total energy consumption. 23% of our total energy consumption is in the form of electricity, electrons. So you still have more than you have more than 3/4 not covered by this, and so there is that that perspective that it's important to bear in mind. Now, I will go through these 3 strategic objectives, starting with sustainability, which obviously covers climate, but more than climate, covers the different aspects of sustainable development and sustainability. We have set an objective for ourselves. It is enshrined in law that we want to be climate neutral by 2050 across the European Union. We have set ourselves target for, earlier we set a target for 2020, 2030. We have now also agreed on a target for where do we need to be by 2040, with a view in order to arrive at net zero by 2050. And that is underpinned by a whole set of regulatory measures, either putting a price on CO2, as I mentioned, the emissions trading scheme, regulations in the field of energy, regulations in the field of transport, agriculture. So it is across the economy, across the entire European system, that objective is enshrined. You will probably have heard over the last year or 2 years discussion about that. Are we still on track to do that? Yes, completely on track. Nobody's questioning the net zero 2050. The discussions that take place are healthy, useful discussions about, are we doing it in the right way? How do we make it simpler? How do we make it more cost effective? How do we do it in the smartest way? But the objective of climate neutrality in 2050 is really set in stone for the European Union. In the field of energy, we have set targets for renewables, and we have set targets for energy efficiency as a way to make better use of the energy we have. Looking at renewables, you can see here the developments over the last few years. And I think what has been really, really interesting to see is the pace at which photovoltaic deployment has grown very, very rapidly. And I think what's really interesting is, again, if you go from this EU level number, and if you look at it at the level of the 27, I don't have all those 27 numbers here, you will see that that's across Europe. And it's in countries where you think, I hadn't expected Hungary to be a big solar power. Hungary is a very big solar power. Obviously, Spain and Portugal have the highest number of sun hours, and so competitive there. I spoke with a former Finnish minister just last week, 10 days ago, and he said to me they have actually done a study in the northern part of Finland, and the number of sun hours is very, very high, because in the summer there is no moment of not any sun. And so there's a lot of surprises in those numbers, but essentially all of Europe has invested in photovoltaic because it's low cost, it's price competitive, thanks to Chinese manufacturing. We can come back to that later, but I think it is important to recognize that low cost has helped us scale up renewables fairly swiftly. Wind is growing not quite as fast, partly because it's larger scale. You don't have the small private investments into that, and you have questions of permitting and long permitting time, so we're working, of course, on that. On energy efficiency, we've been struggling. How do we put that into a slide? Because energy efficiency is just a lot of different things. So I'm not going to go through every single box here. The acronyms you see, we're quite fond of acronyms. EPBD means the Energy Performance of Buildings Directives. EED is the Energy Efficiency Directives. We have rules on eco-design and energy labeling, and you all know it. You go buy an electric appliance, and you can choose between the green A and the red E, and you naturally feel compelled to take the green A because it makes very, very good sense. It is more efficient, so you will use a lot less energy in doing it. So a great success story that turned 50 years 2 days ago. So there's been 50 years of energy efficient product labeling and very, very good results, because of course it has also helped drive innovation to try to have the best possible technology and compete on the A compared to the other compared to the BCDE. So energy efficiency, a really important part of our regulatory framework in the field of energy to reduce consumption. The single biggest challenge here is that a very significant part of the energy we consume end up as waste heat. That is all over the world. It's in Europe, it's here. No country has got that under control. But if you were to imagine you take all of that waste heat, our energy systems would look very, very different. So I just want to leave the thought, because there's so much energy in waste heat, and we can make much better use of it. So a challenge for all of us, and one that we try to address in part of this, in particular the energy performance of buildings, but also energy performance of industrial processes. In order to get where we want to get in 2030, in 2040, and 2050, we're going to need to invest a lot more than what we've been doing. We have been investing a lot, but the scaling up is very, very significant. We have issued a clean energy investment strategy to help push that and scale up. But of course, most of the investments will come from the private sector. There's a good business case. There's lots of company interest, so it is private sector investment. But in the current geopolitical climate, there is also a need for public de-risking, public clarity, making sure that the investment climate is robust, predictable, and that where there is a higher risk than usual, and that's the case at the moment, that we help de-risking with public funds or public policies. So that's the sustainability part. The second one is competitiveness, and this gives you a bit of a sense of what is the role of energy in competitiveness. Now, European competitiveness and European challenges in competitiveness is not only about energy or energy prices, but energy prices are a very significant part of it. If here you see the comparison between Europe and Japan, you can see we have been a bit cheaper than Japan in terms of energy costs, so now we're a little bit more expensive, but essentially at the same level, whereas China is significantly cheaper, and the US as well. The simple story behind that is that we and Japan are net importers of fossil fuels, completely dependent on global markets and global prices. So same there. If you were to put the United Kingdom in there, they would be close to the EU-Japan comparison. But both China and the US have significantly lower prices. Very different types of investments, different policy choices in China compared to the US. We can come back to that as well. So while the curves match fairly well, the explanation, the reasons behind it differ quite significantly. If you look at the concrete electricity bills and energy bills that we have, and the bill you receive when you pay for your energy at home, for your electricity use, consists of many different things. So what we're trying to do is to address the different components. What can we do with taxes and levies, taxes and levies? What can we do on the infrastructure costs? We need to invest more in grids. You just saw the number, the scale of investment needed. That needs to be paid back, and you typically pay that back through the network tariffs. And then, of course, the energy supply. And here, once again, our dependence on global fossil markets has driven up both obviously our energy prices, but also specifically our electricity prices, because part of the electricity is generated, as you saw in one of the earlier slides, by fossil, by gas or coal in particular. So we are looking to address the different components of the energy bill. In the energy supply prices, one of the components is, of course, the emissions trading scheme. And so anything that is coal or gas-based or has a significant CO2 emission, the price is higher because of that addition. So the policy instrument we have put forward to address the competitiveness challenges, again, as you can see, goes way beyond energy policy. And I'm not going to speak to all of these, just to say there is an important energy element, the access to affordable energy, where we set out an action plan for affordable energy. And here you will see the different components. It's really trying to manage the bills, trying to address all of these different components. If I were to say which one is most important, it's obviously always difficult to choose one. But if you look at Action 5, completing the energy union, that hides a lot of potential benefits in closer integration, more interconnection across the European Union, in reducing all of the many system inefficiencies that are there. The system costs are much higher than they have to be. We still curtail wind because there's not either the infrastructure or the storage, the flexibility to cater for it. So there's an energy loss and inefficiencies, and we can address those inefficiencies, the problems in the system, if we work together and make the right investments also in cross-border infrastructure. The others are also very important, but there is that very strong effort ongoing to strengthen our energy union. But yeah, a number of different factors, and I would be glad to say more, but I can see I need to keep up my pace. So moving on to crisis. And what is the situation in global energy markets, and what has our response been? So this one shows you how dramatic the summer, August 2022 to be precise, how dramatic that was in European energy markets. The reference here, the purple one, is the European marker, the European indexation of gas. It's called the TTF, and it was extremely high in August 2022. That had a significant spillover effect on electricity prices, because there was a significant share of gas and electricity, and it was price setting in many hours of the day. So a very, very dramatic crisis in Europe. I'll say a bit more on that. You will also see on the right side here on the 2026, again, prices going up after the situation in the Middle East at the end of February, but at a different scale compared to what we saw in 2022. So I will say a bit about the Russian war in Ukraine, the impact on our markets, what did that mean? And then I will say a bit about the current, the Middle East and the Strait of Hormuz. And then a more forward-looking resilience security question, which is, are we secure when we depend on value chains that are heavily concentrated in one supplier for green technologies? China has either a monopoly or a very, very high share of the market. And so that's the third question of security of supply that I will address. But if I start with the Russian war in Ukraine, when the invasion happened, we were far too dependent on Russian gas. We had almost half, 45% of our natural gas coming from Russia, and natural gas was and is an important part of our energy mix. Russia started turning down very significantly the supply, and that had the dramatic price impact on our markets that you saw in the preceding slide. We cut that down quite significantly already in the first year of the war and have since reduced it further. We have now agreed in legislation to completely phase out Russian gas. We've already gotten rid of the oil with sanctions. We now have both sanctions but also a pathway to a permanent phase out of Russian gas in our system, because it has proven to be such a significant risk to our security to have that dependence, and obviously to have a dependence at that level. 45% dependence on any one supplier is just not a good situation to be in. The challenge of that, the risks of that were increased or were higher because it was pipeline gas. So when that was no longer delivered to Europe, it had nowhere else to go. You can't just divert it. It was just flared, vented, gone. So not a good situation, but significant development. Since then, Norway has stepped up, scaled up its supply. The US investments into shale gas and into LNG has been the single most important development in global markets, and then a number of other suppliers, including Qatar, where, as you know, all supplies are currently cut off. So a lot of changes also since then, but we don't have the data for that. This is just, I like this slide because we were there. We worked through it. It was very, very busy, because there was not a month where energy ministers didn't meet. There was not a month where there was not a need for a new emergency measure, something to help us clarify what is solidarity, clarify how do you save energy, clarify how do you react, what do we do if markets run are reacting in a way that seems disproportionate compared to reality. So I'm not going to go through all of it, but it was a very interesting time, a very, very challenging time in energy policy, starting essentially the morning of the 24th of February, when we all woke up to the news of the Russian invasion, and we met in my office and said, okay, what are we going to do now? How do we handle that? So an interesting and challenging times, a time, as you saw, that brought very, very high prices, but also a time, as you've also seen, that brought a significant shift to our energy system, our energy needs. Now, all of this change came under the headline of Repower EU, the plan we issued just 2 weeks after the invasion to phase out our dependence on Russian energy with a focus on Russian fossil energy. And Repower EU rests on 3 pillars, 3 types of actions. One is to replace the Russian molecules, the Russian energy. Another one is to reduce our consumption, energy efficiency and savings. And the third one is renewable energy. So here on the replacement, you can see the changes. It's a more, same as you've seen. But what is new in this image is how much of the Russian energy was displaced not by other molecules or other suppliers, but displaced either by energy efficiency, energy savings, demand destruction, or by renewable energy. So in other words, now our gas demand has been reduced quite significantly compared to the years, compared to 2022. The years before are really difficult to look at because you had COVID and lockdown, and so you need to then go back to pre-COVID to get a more accurate picture. But a very, very significant change, and a shift, of course, also from pipeline to being, we are now the world's single largest importer of LNG, so we are part of this global market. The second pillar, as I said, is reduction, energy efficiency, energy savings, but also demand destruction, because prices were so high that you saw some industry having to slow down or reduce output. So that's obviously not the type of energy savings that are welcome. That's not the ones we're looking for, but quite a difficult picture in terms of consumption overall over these last years. We took specific measures for energy savings at the peak of the crisis, mandatory targets for cutting energy consumption. And then, as I said, the third one, renewable energy. And here you can see what a significant shift it has been within a very, very short period of time, which I think is actually what's the most impressive, is how late that came, but also how dramatic that development has been, how that composition has significantly changed with renewables, but of course also with nuclear. So that's the 2022 and where we are now. If I move on to the Strait of Hormuz, the current war in the Middle East, the attacks and the response by closing the Strait of Hormuz, there's a lot of similarities in the fact that it is dependence on imported fossil fuels that constitutes the risk. In 2022, for us, it was the very high level of dependence, the very dramatic level of dependence on Russia specifically. In 2026, it is global fossil markets that are driving the crisis and constituting a risk. So again, the lower the share of that imported fossil in our system, the lower the dependence on global fossil markets, the more resilient will we be. But it takes decades. And so how do we manage that? How do we manage the transition? The Strait of Hormuz, as you will certainly all know, so I'm not going to go into details on this, but it is a center point in global energy markets. A very significant share of global crude oil, oil products, and LNG comes out of the Strait of Hormuz. A lot of that, by far the largest share, goes to Asia. And so you will have seen in this crisis that the most immediately impacted are countries in Asia. You have countries that have literally had to shut down restaurants because they needed LPG or needed some other oil product, fossil product. They don't have it. So you see shutdown of shops, of restaurants. You see very, very dramatic measures. I was in Egypt a month or so ago, and they have taken very significant measures of shutting off street lights, don't go out too late, close shops early, close restaurants early, in order to make sure that there is enough energy. You have small island states that see their entire electricity generation based on diesel. It's a humanitarian risk, it is a genuine risk to livelihood. And then you have countries that suffer from high prices, but that can pay that import bill and can manage that. So you really have a lot of different circumstances globally in how the crisis impacts. The impact is first of all in Asia, where most of it went. Of course, we in Europe and here in the United Kingdom, you see the high prices as well. But the impact is different compared to what it is in smaller countries and in Asia. For us in Europe and also here in the United Kingdom, the biggest risk is in oil products, and jet fuels is the number one. We've received a lot of our jet fuels from the Middle East region, and that is a risk we're not an immediate security of supply, but we're obviously following it closely. And as always, prices follow the supply-demand balance. Markets are no longer in balance, and prices go up. I think if you read what market analysts say and you read and hear discussions out there, the one surprise is that markets have not been reacting more strongly than they have. There's still, if you look at future prices, they've gone up, but they are not August 2022, and one can speculate about it, but it is interesting to note that relative calm, considering a very dramatic situation in the Strait of Hormuz, that again is a center point for global energy markets. Jet fuels and diesel, here you can see a much more significant impact. Jet fuel with a very, very high increase, and that's a few weeks ago. It is still high. It's maybe a bit lower now, but it is still very, very high. And that is a result of the fact that so much of global jet fuel was refined in the Middle East and exported from there. And so countries around the world are scrambling to make sure that they have the refining capacity or have access to refined to jet fuels exported from other suppliers. So here a significant market impact. I don't know if you've booked your summer holidays yet and if you're flying. I have been surprised to see that airline tickets are not already more expensive than they are. So again, it's very interesting to see how markets respond and what are expectations. But I can assure you that in Europe there will still be enough jet fuels for summer holidays. So if you want to go somewhere where you're going by plane, it should still be possible. We are following it very, very closely. And then gas prices, of course, also up. But again, if you compare to August 2022 and the drama of August 2022, yes, prices are up. They were already higher because we were at the tail end of this other crisis and because they were structurally higher in global markets. If the war in the Middle East hadn't happened, you would have seen a decrease in global gas prices because of the increase in output, both from the Middle East. Qatar had plans for a significant increase, and in particular the US had plans for a very significant increase. Now that oversupply, which would have brought lower prices, has now been eaten up by the loss over these last months, and the time it will take for Qatar and others to bring their supply back online. The repairs that will delay the additional output. There will be additional output from the US, but that balance we had been looking towards and hoped for will take a few years longer before it arrives. I mentioned before the impact of the 2022 crisis on electricity prices in Europe, which was very, very dramatic. As you can see, that is a bit less dramatic now, but with very significant variations. This is where, if you compare the EU average and you look at it nationally, the difference is enormous. If you are Finland, you have an electricity mix that is nuclear and renewables, and that means whatever happens in global oil and gas markets, it really does not impact your electricity price in any significant way. If you are Italy and you have quite a high share of gas-generated power, then your electricity prices will be much more impacted by the global fossil high prices. And you can go through all of these. There's a story, there's a national story behind it. And again, super important for us as policymakers to make sure that when we design policy, design crisis response or preparedness, that we take into account all of these different national circumstances. We are, like everyone else, trying to do scenario planning. What can happen in the Middle East? And what does it mean? What does it mean if it stays closed much longer, if it opens now? if it stays closed until the summer, until after the summer. This is not a precise science in any way. It is really more drawing in on all the different analysis and data that we have to see what is it we need to be prepared for, what are the scenarios, what could happen. And again, knowing that markets have responded more calmly than what we would have and what most analysts would have forecast. But obviously ready in each of these different market segments to make sure that we stay secure, that we have, that our transport, that our electricity, that all of these uses of energy are safe. I think the main point I would have here is the last one, the economic impact. We talk of it as an energy crisis. It is an energy crisis, but it is a global, significant burden on the global economy, because not only energy exports are hit, there are a number of other chemicals or compounds that are hit by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. So anything that impacts fertilizer prices will have an impact on food prices and on food security in parts of the world. And so there's a lot happening there that is not covered in what I speak about in energy, but it is a bigger economic and macroeconomic issue globally, and again, obviously with different impacts depending on where you are in the world. Our policy response has been Accelerate EU, so building on what we did in Repower EU, but taking it further. And there's maybe just one lesson here. Obviously, we need to coordinate closely, we need to work together, we need to make sure that our households and businesses are as protected as possible. But above all, the more homegrown clean energy we have, the lower the share of fossil in our system, the more resilient will we be. And so the action already envisaged as part of our net zero agenda, as part of the Green Deal and targets for 30, 40, 50, that is what we need to do more of and do faster, including by faster permitting, scaling up in investments, because that is how we best strengthen our security. Now, the third aspect of crisis or security that I wanted to point to is the other challenge, the other autonomy question, which lies in the value chains, the supply chains of the technologies needed for the energy transition. Because when we have, as I said, a lower share, we're less dependent on imported fossils, we are more resilient. But of course, we will need energy, we will need more energy, we'll need more electricity, and using renewables, nuclear, and all of the technologies that go with the energy system, we will be dependent on the imports of both critical minerals, but also both the extraction, the processing, the refining, and all of the different components that form part of the energy system and that form part of a digitized economy as well. So we are, of course, working to have secure and sustainable supply, both of the raw materials, but also of the industrial supply chains. And what we can see is we need to work very, very closely with partners globally, but we also need to manufacture more at home. Not to be self-sufficient or independent, because that would be very expensive and it doesn't quite make sense. We like partnerships, we like working with other people, we like trade and investment, but to have more of a home base, more manufacturing at home. The really big challenge here is that critical minerals are not just concentrated, they are extremely concentrated. So at a global level, it is simply a very, it's quite a dramatic level of concentration. Concentration is always a challenge. Concentration on one player is a risk. What happens if anyone has that market power? It means that market power can be used to manipulate markets and use that power to push out other investors, slow down, avoid competition, slow down investments. So that level of concentration is never a good thing, regardless of who has that market power. And you can see how important it is. This is an example of the rare earth oxide and going into specific products. This gives you a picture of some of the most important minerals for the energy transition. And the left one, everything that's in orange, that is where China is the top refiner, and you can see in a number of refining gallium, graphite, all of this really very, very close to 100%, so close to a global monopoly. And you can see over here, turning that into the batteries for electric vehicles, one of the key technologies for the transition, for our for our economy. Again, very, very high level of concentration on one single supplier. So there is a risk in that concentration. We try to address that in the European Union through a strategy, through investments to reduce our critical mineral dependencies, the Resource EU Action Plan, and I don't think I'll go through each of the elements, but it is an important area. But I want to underline that it really is very much about partnership with others, working with partners, bringing trade investment to have a more resilient global value chain and supply chain, both when it comes to minerals, but also when it comes to all the many technologies that are part of the energy transition, because a high degree of concentration is a risk also at a global level. So we're working on that. So it's more the energy system of today, but also the energy system of more green technologies, more clean homegrown energy. It's more resilient, it's more secure, but there's also something to look at there to make sure that resilience is a genuine resilience. So that was my last slide. I very much look forward to questions and to the discussion with you. Feel free to ask whatever you want to ask. If I can't answer, I will let you know, but I will give it a try as much as possible. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Ditte. That was a real tour de force, actually. I was thinking at the beginning, it's 3 pillars of energy policy, isn't it? If you remove any one of them, the whole thing falls over.
Yes,
so maybe
absolutely.
That's the analogy to choose.
Absolutely.
So, anyway, thank you for that. And we've got questions have come through online, but we always prefer in-person questions. So who would like to get questions going? I have, of course, some ideas here, but yes, please fire away. And do you mind just very quickly introducing yourself and what course you're doing while you're here, or who you are?
Is it allowed if I'm not doing a course here?
Far away, just
Perfect.
In a sentence, if you can introduce yourself, just so that everybody in the room, so Ditte knows who you are.
My name is Vera. I'm from the University of St. Gallen, political scientist at heart, and by study.
Welcome.
My question is, you mentioned the 3 pillars of the strategy, and given the geopolitical realities that you've mentioned, and I would beg to differ on one point that you said, that the less fossil energies, the more resilient we will be, because the more renewables in the system, in the electric grid, the more unstable it can become. So to what extent, and that's the question, might policymakers, given those geopolitical realities, prioritize security over sustainability in the coming years?
Let's take that one straight away, because
Yes,
it's such a big one.
Yes, it is, yes. It's a good question. So the notion that an energy system based on a large share of renewables is less reliable and less stable, that I would start by questioning. I think there's been discussion about it. I think there's quite a lot of misinformation out there suggesting that it's impossible, you can't run a system with high shares of renewables, but we have examples of, yes, you can. Where I would agree is that running that system with high shares of renewables it's more complex. So the electricity system of today and our electricity system of the coming decades is more complex. It requires not just obviously the generation, it requires significantly more investment into grids and networks and infrastructure. It requires flexibility, battery storage. It really requires a mix. I also think, but experts differ on this, I also think that the best mix is one where you have some renewables and where you have something stable. So either nuclear or gas-generated power. So can we have an electricity system that is 100% clean, 100% renewable and nuclear, or do we need that flexible and stability helping mechanism that, for example, gas-generated power gives? I think most experts agree that you do need some other component in addition to renewables, but it can be fairly small. It can be a capacity mechanism that is there, ready to step in. I think one of the experiences, so 2 experiences in real life that I want to mention that help form the analysis and the risk assessment. The first is you will probably all have seen the blackout in the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, and the report that came out of it. So quite a dramatic blackout, and I think one that we had thought that could not happen. We had our systems under control, but it did happen, and it took quite a while to get it back online. In the immediate aftermath, there was lots of speculation about what cost it, and there was, of course, suggested, it's all the renewables. It's impossible to run a system of renewables. Now, as you've seen in the report from the transmission system operators, and it's an independent report and independent analysis, it was not because of the renewables. It was a question of system and voltage management and being good enough at doing that. So yes, it is more complex, but it can absolutely be done. The other example, the other real-life example that I think is important to remember is what the Germans refer to as a Dunkelflaute. So in the North Sea, I'm from close to the North Sea. It's always windy until it's not. And if you suddenly have 2 or 3 weeks of no wind, the Dunkelflaute, then it does become a significant challenge with these high shares of wind, or similar with sun and solar. So yes, you do need other things to complement that, whether it's nuclear. You can cover a lot of it by storage, but we do have a problem with electricity storage. It's too short term, so if you have a 3-week Dunkelflaute, you will have a problem. And so again, you need, I think, some capacity mechanism of gas-generated power to also be there. But on the whole, a more resilient system for Europe is one where we have more homegrown clean energy. That is, again, the specificity also of Europe, that we are not a significant producer of fossil. If I was sitting here as a representative of a country that extracts significant fossil, then my security definition would look different, because I would not be dependent on global markets. Then I would still have my climate concerns and the need to reduce emissions globally, but it would be a different discussion around security.
Thanks. Yes, yeah.
Thank you so much for your time. My name is Andrews. I'm doing a PhD here in financial economics. My question is very much related to that, in the sense that, so you said we require, even for the next decades, capacities in gas or nuclear, and especially looking at the gas supply, we see that the gas price determines, because the electricity auction is designed in a way in that the marginal electron is priced, and the marginal electron is overly proportional gas, and hence gas prices determine our electricity prices, even when we're using not that much gas, actually. So my question to you would be, what's your take on shale gas, and should the EU encourage the extraction of shale gas on its territory?
So this brings me back to the opening articles, the articles about energy policy and the national mix. So it is a national choice whether countries decide to invest in extraction of fossil or not. If they decide to invest in this extraction, they have to do it in a way that is, of course, compliant with our net zero target, with our legislation, making sure that that extraction is as clean as possible, so that we reduce methane emissions linked to the extraction. But it is a national choice. What you've seen over the last few years is you've got some countries that are extending the extraction that has already been invested in. You've got other countries that are extracting new. Romania will put the Neptune field online fairly soon, and it's sizable. And you've got countries in the Eastern Med that are doing the same thing. So not shale, but fossil extraction, and at a level where it is relevant for the European energy system. If I then go from that factual description, if you will, to what makes sense for an efficient energy system, then we know that electrification is by far the most efficient use of energy. You simply get many more kilometers in your EV than you do in a combustion engine car. The same goes for other forms of transport, or for heating and cooling, for example, much more efficient. So we know that the smartest way to use energy, to use less energy, and energy is expensive, whatever source it is, so the more efficient you are, the better. Electrification is a really important part of that. Then from there to the electricity mix, the more fossil you have in your electricity mix, the more dependent will you be on these global markets and prices. And the slide we had about different electricity prices in member states, I think, show that very, very clearly. The Italian vulnerability, because of the high prices, because of the high share of gas in the system, compared to this Finnish beautiful mix of renewables and nuclear. So the lower the share of fossil in your electricity generation, the less you will be impacted by the volatility and price spikes.
I'll take one at the back, just there, because that's where the microphone is. Yes, over to you. Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. I'm Tom. I'm studying a master's in environmental change management. My question's to do with your really interesting slide on net zero, and it's really impressive to see that we're on track for net zero, because no small thanks to yourself, it's no small feat. But on a global scale, I think it's sensible to state that, you know, the carbon budget is looking about another 6 years, and we're not on track for net zero. So in terms of EU's energy policy, where do you see its place in that overshoot scenario?
Really good question, and indeed, the climate challenge is global, and it can only be solved globally and by working together. And as you say, we are collectively not on track. I was at an interesting meeting last week at the International Energy Agency. They have started a process of having energy transition dialogues with the host of COP, so in this case, host of COP 31, both Turkey and Australia, and then both businesses and governments, looking at what can the energy sector do. Because the energy sector represents such a significant share of CO2 output. You've got agriculture sector, you've got some other sectors, but it's essentially either energy production or energy consumption that is the very, very big driver. And so the energy sector is essential. What I thought was really encouraging at a time where the conversation about climate is more complex, is more challenged. What was very encouraging was to see this convergence around the energy sector can actually do it, and electrification emerging as the point where everyone agrees, whether you then electrify with renewables or with nuclear or with gas generation or other sources. Electrification is a really important and necessary component of that. So I left that meeting encouraged by that convergence and by that readiness to work together.
Yes.
And Miles, I'm Yushi. I'm doing a PhD in biology here. And my question around homegrown clean energy and also electrification and also the energy union you touched upon. So China, because of the population and also of the geography, they have rely on generating energy from the west and then transporting them to the east where most people live. So I was wondering what lessons could the EU take from China, but equally keep more independence so that aspect doesn't become a leverage for China in terms of negotiation on other aspects?
Really good question. And I think one of the big discussions in energy systems is this question of electrostate versus fossil state or oil state or gas state. And China has had a very impressive increase in the share of electricity in its energy system. China is now above 30% electrified, whereas we are still at 23%. That has come through, and you probably know that better, but it has come through significant investments, obviously, into power generation, but also into grids and the system, as well as battery and all the technologies that underpin it, the supply chains that underpin it. So it's a very impressive development in the energy sector in very, very little time, and it's clear that those investments have been smart and shields China also at this time of a global crisis. Still high fossil dependence, still high import dependence, but that electrification is in itself an important factor. We are taking measures to accelerate the electrification on our side as well, including through investment into grids, into storage, into reducing the bottlenecks, the barriers to electrification. Where I would say there's a very big difference is that the Chinese investments have been a mixture of a lot of renewables, a lot of nuclear, but also a lot of coal-fired power plants. We in Europe are investing in renewables, nuclear as well, but you will not see new investments into coal-fired power plants because it is by far the most emitting form of electricity generation. So that's the biggest difference. But I think there's a lot of other lessons learned in the investments and in what has taken place in the Chinese electrification and energy system.
If I may, can I bring in a couple of questions here from people who've fed the questions in online. They're linked. One is, how can European energy policy be tailored in such a way that is just for those beyond its borders? And then another participant wanted to say, how do you see EU-African energy geopolitics evolving, particularly in the context of the US-Iran war? I mean, this sort of
questions.
Yeah, they seem to fit in with this conversation. So I think I'll just feed those.
Very, very good questions. So we in the European Union we have an objective of building close partnerships with our immediate neighbours, but also neighbours across the Mediterranean, so in Northern Africa and the Middle East, all around us. And of course, a lot of those partnerships and a lot of that cooperation is linked to energy, depending on what is that country, what profile does that country have. As you saw, we import a lot of energy from Norway directly, primarily gas, but also electricity. We share an electricity system with the United Kingdom, including in the North Sea. Benefits all of us. We are building infrastructure with countries in North Africa, both gas infrastructure and electricity infrastructure. A lot of the countries in North Africa currently have energy shortages. They have not had sufficient investments to meet the growing demand, but huge potential when it comes to photovoltaic, for example. And then we import oil and gas from the Middle East and from countries in North Africa. Algeria, Libya are important suppliers to the European Union. And so that partnership is really everything. It is about the energy needed now, it's about the molecules, it is about shared investment, shared projects around electricity, in particular renewable electricity and infrastructure, and then it's about green molecules, green hydrogen, for example. One of the things I think is interesting when you look at this energy system when we're a bit further down, we're still, I think, in a complex phase of the transition. Again, a transition is always, it's just complex, it's difficult. And we're probably at one of the most difficult moments now because we still don't have everything we need, plus you have this crisis at the same time. But if you look a little bit ahead, then I think the energy transition will create new opportunities for countries that have not been big suppliers or big players because they did not have that geological reality. And that, I think, is going to be very interesting to see. You have a number of countries, either in North Africa or in other parts of Africa, that have the potential to become significant suppliers of green hydrogen or other clean fuels. And so that, I think, is a really interesting landscape to look into, and one, again, that can also have significant socioeconomic impacts in different parts of the world.
Far away. Yeah.
Thank you. And since you mentioned green hydrogen, I'm curious what role your DG, if any, plays in funding innovation or making sure that the EU has the tools, publicly backed tools to innovate on this or nuclear or many other forms of potential future sources of energy. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a good question, because we know that we're going to need clean molecules, so clean fuels, clean gases to help decarbonize the hard-to-abate sectors. There are some industry sectors that will need significant heat, and that is difficult by electricity. Some can come hopefully from small modular reactors. That's another technology. And then we're going to need some of these. Green hydrogen is one very good example of that. Also a good example for maritime transport, for example. So important uses. What we have tried to do in Europe is a combination, and that is in my area of policy, it's a combination of creating a clear regulatory framework so that there's a market that can develop. It knows what it is developing into, what are the conditions, what are the rules, it's a market. Trying to set some clear criteria for what is considered a green molecule or a clean molecule, so that it's not just pretending that something in green when it's not, but to allow for a green premium and to help facilitate and incentivize investments, to have these clear criteria. also to have public support, to have a market for hydrogen so that you can help contracts for difference, help the offtake meet the production and the supply. The challenge, I would say, is that a lot of this was designed pre-COVID. And a lot happened to the global economy, to investments, to markets over that period of time. We've seen significant increase in costs. We've seen inflationary pressures, higher interest rates, more uncertainty, higher risks. And so what we can see is the investments needed and the forecast we did is a bit off mark. Simply, it hasn't been accelerating as fast as we'd wanted to. So what we're doing now, and what we announced in the Accelerate EU, is a simplification of a lot of this to say, okay, this is the right direction. It's good to make sure that it is green and clean, but if we require too much too quickly, we will not be able to bring the investments that are needed. So we're going to stay the course, keep the direction and the strategic objective, but simplify to help facilitate that. The other aspect that I think is really important, again, in green hydrogen, is we will produce some in Europe, but we're not going to be able to produce all the hydrogen molecules that would be needed in the future economy. So we're very much in the market for partnerships, working with others, and again, across the world.
Yes, right at the back there.
Hi, I'm Eamon. I do chemistry. And on a similar note to that, I wondered what future you see for biogenic fuels like biomethane, HVO, stuff like that. Is that much ado about nothing, or will they eventually displace a large portion of natural gas, etc.?
Very, very good question. I'm glad you reminded me of that particular aspect and that molecule. I'm originally from Denmark, and in the Danish gas system, actually biomethane has displaced, I think it's more than 30% of fossil gas. Mm-hmm. Partly because it's a country that has agriculture and it has agricultural waste, and that can go into the production of biomethane, and so it actually does work. So what we're trying to do all over Europe, because there's huge potential in Europe for that, to at least displace some of the fossil molecules. So again, more homegrown energy, different source or different type, but a relevant one. So very, very highly relevant for the European energy system. And because the molecules are the same, they're interchangeable, it's very easy to inject it into the existing infrastructure and gas system.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Lucas. I'm doing a postdoc here on futures of standards and regulation of EV batteries. So there's already a takeaway of what my question is going to be about. You talked a lot about our dependence on China for both critical materials as well as directly on batteries. Now, we saw recently that European car manufacturers are stopping to actually produce EVs or stopping innovation in this field, whereas CATL is producing 1,500 kilometer batteries. My question is, given the unique position of the European Commission to bring out standards and regulation on a multinational setting, where do you see a plausible future that is bringing more European innovation in this space as well?
Very, very good question, and a bit beyond my immediate area of responsibility, so I'll respond as well as I can. If I start by responding with some of the developments we've seen just over the last few months. So since the 28th of February, the crisis in the Middle East, you will have seen the demand for electric vehicles increase very, very significant, very, very quickly, and it's all generations. So it's older people, so I'm not going to move to that, it's difficult. And now, you can be 90 and you go buy your EV and you realize it actually works. So I do think that, and hope that there will be market developments, that demand has reached the tipping point. If you look at in Norway, I think it's almost every single car sold now is an electric car. It just makes good sense. And with that demand, producers will also see an increasing interest in making the investments into technological development and strengthen their position there. It is difficult, again, because of the European innovation in that sector has been lagging behind. There's significant competition, in particular from Chinese developers and Chinese technology. And so there is a need for significant investments into that, both into the innovation, but also to the scaling up of that. What we try to do, as you also imply in your question in the European Commission, the regulatory framework matters, and so the requirements to cars, the prospect of phasing out the new cars with combustion engine over some time, and there's always a bit of discussion exactly how and when, but it is a very clear objective. So I do think that combination of a regulatory framework, a clear direction, but market developments, the demand increasing, the high fossil prices, the uncertainties, that will help push those developments. The other thing we see, I think, and that's on the battery side in particular, is again, very high level of concentration, and that's a risk. What we also see as a result of that concentration is more research into alternative battery technologies that do not, for example, require lithium. And some of those are really encouraging, including in Europe. They don't get as much attention because it's still early days, but they are there and it's happening. So I'm fairly hopeful that these different factors will come together.
By the way, Oxford invented the lithium battery, and we're hopeful we'll invent the next one.
Please do.
We're working on it. I'll take two more questions, and there's one at the back there, and then I'll take one in the middle here. It's very arbitrary from yourself in the green shirt. Sorry about you in the white shirt. I went for the green shirt instead. But let's take the. There was a question at the back there. To start with that, no, I was just giving to this gentleman here in the green shirt. But there's one at the back, and then we'll take two more questions. I think the organisers, I've got how strict are my instructions to wrap at 15.
Feel free to group if you.
Are we okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm looking around. Okay. I'm being allowed to let it go because these are great questions. Okay. Far away at the back.
Thank you so much for this great talk. I think you just had a light touch on waste energy. So I wanted to ask what measures are you taking for thermal energy storage, and what potential do you see in thermal energy?
And then can we add in the question here? Yeah, thank you.
Right, thank you very much. So my name is Christopher. I'm currently studying Masters in Engineering Science. So my question is, you mentioned about most of the investments being private but guided by public risking and also public guidance in where to go. I think this is quite a similar question that we in the UK is also exploring with REMA, the Review for Electricity Market Arrangements, and all the other policies that we're developing. So where do you see the balance lies between how much a centralized guide should be versus just letting the market do its course? And how do you avoid going too far into one direction or the other? Thank you.
Okay, so two very contrasting questions. If you take them, yeah.
Yes. Thermal storage. It's very interesting that it doesn't have a higher presence in the energy system. It's fairly low cost. It's fairly efficient. It's fairly simple. You see, again, across Europe, if you go to different member states, you will see different investments and different uses of that. I've spoken to some project developers and some companies that have invested, and it is quite impressive what they can achieve at a fairly low cost. So we are trying to look at, well, what are the obstacles? Why is it not more investments? And what can we do to facilitate that? And in a way, that's a segue into your question on this, on markets versus regulation, on private financing versus public financing. I think we have seen that relying exclusively on markets comes at does not always bring the results. Part of it is that even when we say we rely exclusively on markets, we've got a number of measures and policies that actually push one way or another. So to give you one very simple example, in many European countries, electricity is taxed at a higher rate than gas. So there you have a very strong incentive not to electrify, whereas we know electrification makes more sense. And that's just a very simple example, but you have a number of efficiencies and system questions that will require a framework to develop. Of course, you want to make sure you don't overdo it and take away the advantages of the market. So what we try to do is to have a functioning market, including the electricity market. I think there was a question before about electricity price setting and how gas is price setting in a number of hours. There's been a lot of discussion. Do we want that market? Do we want it to be a market, or do we want to regulate prices or do something else? But we know we will have the lowest cost, the most efficient system if it's a market, even if the market is not perfect. And so there's always that balance. I also think when it comes to the government role in relation to investments, what we want to make sure is that any intervention we do does not displace private financing and private funds, but that it de-risks and helps those investments take place, that it removes some of the risks. And again, I think when we are in the current global circumstances, there's overall a higher level of risk than we have seen for many years. And that does, everything else being equal, mean that there is a different need. The role of government in de-risking is probably different compared to what it had been before. We've had 3 dramatic crises, one after another: COVID, Ukraine, and now the Middle East. So there is a concern that the global macroeconomic circumstances will not be conducive, that markets will simply not respond to the needs for investment, and that we therefore have to intervene. But I think it's a very good question, because it's a constant and careful balance, so that we don't displace private fund, and that we don't use taxpayers' money on something where it's not best used.
So just a heads up, we'll aim to finish in about 5 minutes. And I've noticed a question over there, but I've got a couple of questions here because coming in, and I'm impressed that this question has not been asked yet, but I'm going to ask it now anyway. So congratulations on your unpredictability, audience. So I'm now going to ask the very predictable question: what do you think about the impact of AI on energy policy?
Yes.
And are you very impressed that this audience did not ask this question for such a long time?
Yes.
That somebody had to ask it.
Very good, very good. So I think maybe if I enlarge the question a bit, that it's both a question of AI, digitization on our energy system. It's clear that we will see a significant increase in the demand for electricity. And if we don't see that significant increase in demand for electricity, we have a problem. Because that means we're simply we're not investing, we're not doing what we need to do, we're missing out on important developments. So if we have enough electricity to meet the demand, we have a problem. If we don't have enough electricity to meet the demand, we also have a problem. So there's a lot to do there in terms of planning of energy systems and investments. The other thing the other aspects of it that I think are important to bear in mind is, one, AI is very energy intensive. So there will be a need for these investments. But AI can also very significantly help increase the efficiencies in the system and reduce inefficiencies in the system. So there's also a bonus, there's a gain from AI. Now, you cannot compare the two in any way, but I do think it's important to look at that aspect as well. A third aspect that is interesting in an electricity system context is that with generative AI, it's a different type of electricity demand and electricity consumption. You're going to see not a constant high level as, you've got a data center and you need to cool it down and power it. But with generative AI, you're going to see bursts of energy consumption. So it's going to be much less predictable and more difficult to manage in a system. And before, I think you, in your first question, asked about the system management and stability of the system. And it is a factor that needs to be placed into it. Probably AI itself is best placed to find a way to manage that challenge, but it is another aspect. So I think there are many energy system aspects to AI: how we use it, how do we benefit from it, how do we manage on the supply side, but also on the system and the stability side.
Grand. And the blue shirt in the corner. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm actually doing a diploma in AI, and my question was going to be about AI data.
I got there first.
Yeah, you stole my thunder. But I work in the energy and climate sector, and maybe switching the topic a little bit, thinking ahead to 2050, do you think the net zero target is actually achievable in the context of AI, electric vehicles, the energy transition? I mean, the energy transition itself has already, taken 20, 25 years. Do you really think that we'll be able to get that further distance by 2050? And if not, by how much do you think we're going to overshoot?
Very, very good question. Yes, we're not entirely on track. We need to do more. We need to accelerate. I think the current market circumstances, you've seen the acceleration that has happened. I mentioned e-vehicles. You could look at the same numbers for heat pumps, for investment into renewables. I mean, the current market situation, the crisis, will help us accelerate the investments that are necessary for net zero. So yes, I do think it is achievable. As you rightly say, ideally, that should come together with an increased energy consumption, electricity consumption, that follows from developments, AI, growth, well-being, access to energy globally, all of these different things. But that increase in consumption should be balanced by the fact that electricity is so much more efficient as an energy source. The difference is very, very significant. So that will balance some of it hopefully by our ability to reduce the system inefficiencies. There's a lot of inefficiencies in our energy system. So if you can make very small investments into digitization of your grids, of your networks, and you can save a lot of energy by doing it. So there's a lot of scope there. And then coming back to the waste heat, because there's so much energy that is simply lost every day. So I do think that those things, if we go about it smartly and if we make the investments that are necessary, I do think, yes, it will be possible.
And because that's such a positive note to end on, I'm going to suggest we end it there. But thank you again, Ditte Juul Jørgensen, for taking the time with us here. Thank you very much.